I was thinking about how my experiences with learning Go take me back to these very, very basic concepts around reading and looking a few steps ahead. It reminded me of a camping trip I took with my wife and my son this past summer. We were around the campfire. It was nighttime, and we wanted to teach our son a card game. And this was the first time we had played cards with him because he's now at the age where he can do that. And we played a game called Go Fish. And if you don't know what Go Fish is, it's where you are each handed a certain number of cards. You're not supposed to show those cards, but you're trying to get 3 or 4 of a kind, a 2 or a 5 or whatever the number or face card is. And you ask the other players if they have any of a certain type of card. And if they have it, you get to take it from them and make those points. If they don't have it, you say, go fish. And you go to a pile of cards that are face down on the table and take a card from that pile. It was really interesting to see how our son, who is just starting to understand numbers and symbols and kind of match and connect things, how challenging it was for him to just put those very simple pieces together. And it did remind me so much of when I was starting to learn Go for the first time. When I look on online forums and things on Go and see all of the new players that are asking questions about how these basic things work, or that they're doing tutorials and learning about the game, but then they try to play a game and they just feel completely lost. It is just amazing to me that all of us, or a lot of us, even survive through that initial entry period and actually get to a point where we're like, oh, this actually makes sense. The other piece to this whole story with my son was that he ended up not winning the first time. And you could see that he got very sore about it and was very upset that he didn't win. It also reminds me about being sort of a gracious winner and not being a sore loser, and these forms of etiquette in Go, if you're following some of the more traditional approaches of being polite and asking for a review, even if you lose, and those sorts of things. I like that it teaches those things in Go, and that's something that my son needs to work on. So with that, we'll get started, and this is All Things Go. Devin Fraze now talks with us a bit about online Go events and how to think about making it more interesting, interactive, with commentating, with visuals, and what we can leverage from other successful sporting events or things online that help pull us in. Take a listen. What is it like helping organize online events in terms of knowledge set needed, the amount of time and effort required compared to like an in-person event? Has this been more of a focus for you personally?
I think generally I've focused on running in-person events, and then for online these days, I'm focused more on helping broadcast in-person events and sometimes online events. But I have run online events in the past. I've run various things, especially during COVID. For both online and in-person events, it's actually a lot of the same stuff. The most important thing is essentially what every Go player should know is read ahead. Of course, you can let your intuition guide you to some point, but you really, really, really need to sit down and meticulously read ahead and try to figure out what am I going to need next and when, and try to read all the way to the end. No skimping, because on game day, you're not going to want to be like, oh crap, where is this key thing that I didn't think about? Prizes. Oh no. If you don't have prizes for your tournament and you get to the end and people are like, cool, I won. Now what? You're going to be kind of sad. So, and luckily a lot of Go players have experienced Go events. And so we understand the general layout. So it should be more like reading a ladder than it should be reading some sort of super complex Joseki. But there are different complexities and things people forget. One of the big things, it's small, it feels small, table numbers for in-person events. You get there, all the boards and the clocks and stuff are out, and you're like, okay, guys, here's who you're playing. And they're like, okay, where do I sit? And you're like, oops.
Do you think now that COVID has really receded, do you see that there's more of a need or a big need for more people to help with online events or having more online events?
Yeah, I think there's still definitely a need. I mean, there's a lot of players around the world, in the country who don't live near a Go Club. They don't live near places that go tournaments, and they don't want to take the time and money, or they aren't able to take the time and money to travel to these places. So for them, online events is kind of critical. Typically, these people do things like leagues, which is a type of online event, but it happens over a much longer period of time. And there's also kind of like automatic online events that happen on OGS. But I've noticed that people in the forums specifically will get some idea in their head and have a fun thing to do for bringing more players in. The type of online events I've focused on more of late has been less general population per se and more creating spectacles for people to enjoy. So I have had situations where I've done invitationals for strong players and then created these interesting types of events like the Hogwarts House Hustle, for example. So we all worked together and we had a bunch of people and they were each sorted by the sorting hat, quote unquote, into houses. And so we had 8 players overall. And Albert Yen, for example, was in Gryffindor, as he should be. And they competed in it. And one of the fun twists of that game, too, is there was no resignation, or essentially resignation would cost you dearly because every point that you earned in the game was a point for your house. If you just get absolutely crushed by the other player, it's going to be bad. So a little bit of incentivization to try and go big or go home versus just lose by a little bit. Or if you're like, oh crap, I'm about to die everywhere, like you can kind of try to, like, hey, listen, I'm just going to try to even the score as much as possible and not let my house get ruined. We ended up having multiple people time out, which is wild. So that did not bode well, but it's still somehow balanced out because like maybe one person from each house did it. So it was fine. And then at the end, there's even a bigger twist where I had them play quote unquote Voldemort. So actually I had everybody sign on OGS and, well, they're already playing OGS, but play the 9-Dan AI. We call them Voldemort, right? So, and the goal is just to like earn a certain number of points. Cause of course they're going to lose per se, but like how much you lose by is going to help, your house and how many points you can gain in that game per se. So that was a really fun kind of like unique event that we put together. That's kind of been more my interest because I've been thinking a lot how to make Go more fun to watch, like people watch esports or normal sports. So
you were just talking about trying to make the events more engaging to the audience. One thing that you did during, I believe it was the pro qualifier, but it might have been somewhere else. You've incorporated the AI systems into the watching the live events so that it has that more realistic win-loss probability and scoring.
Right.
What are some other elements you've added or you've seen added online for Go events over time to make things more viewer-friendly and interactive?
In sports and esports, there's an asymmetry of information that's given to the viewer that the players don't necessarily have. So in American football, you have this line of scrimmage that the people need to get to before the 4th down. And the players kind of are generally aware they, maybe their coach tells them they can see the guy on the sideline, but the viewers on screen get this very special yellow line artificially drawn across the screen that even like nicely goes underneath players as they run across it. And we have to ask ourselves, why did the broadcasters take the time and money and energy to develop this line for the viewers? And of course, it's because it enhances the viewing experience. It makes it easier and more obvious for those who are newer to understand, oh, they got to get to that line, So instead of just saying like, hey, 3rd down, 2 to go or something, you have, which any American football fan might understand, but you have a visual for where that person needs to go. Additionally, in like League of Legends, which I don't watch a whole lot of, but I did study to understand this better, they have typically a fog of war when you're playing. You can't see around everywhere. You have to kind of move to explore it. But the viewer does not have that fog of war. The viewer can see the map clearly. The viewer knows, oh my gosh, these guys are about to come together in this next, when they turn around the corner and there's going to be some sort of fight. So it helps, again, enhance the experience of the viewer. So in Go, that's the idea, is like we don't really have that. We have, just this commentator giving good commentary. And in chess, they typically have AI as well, for example, and they have all these little arrows they can draw on the screen. But in Go, we lack a lot of these tools. So I've been thinking more about how do we develop tools. Of course, we have the AI win rate graph, which is a circle. I've decided to use a circle to kind of clearly, represent percentages and fills up white or black depending on who's winning. There's also a bar at the bottom, much like the yellow line of scrimmage in American football, where the players are racing to the middle because they're trying to get more than half of the board. And so for that one, I use Chinese scoring because that's essentially, what they use, with the line offset a little bit for Comey. And, the hope is that new players can see like, oh, like, they're trying to fill the bar and whoever has filled more of the bar is going to win. And that's estimating territory. It also gives a number count for the amount of points, predicted for the players at a given time. It's not locked in many cases. And actually we give a gradation of color for those points based on the confidence of them. If it's deep black, then we're sure black has these points. If it's kind of like getting lighter gray, like lighter black, then it's kind of like more uncertain that black will have these points. And then we have also a coloring on the board itself of the last move played to tell you, oh, it's, either blue move, which we've come to associate with perfect level play, green for good, yellow, orange, and then eventually red, and even like deep purple, which is, kind of meant to mean a blunder. And there's a little visual rubric on the side, lining them up from top to bottom, blue to purple, giving you some sort of understanding of what that is. And the color changes not only on the board, but inside of the winning percentage as well. So when you watch it swing around widely, you have a different idea of why. Oh, look, it's a big purple move. That's why black was winning, by 60% one turn ago. Now it's white winning by 70. So
do you get any sense when you go on OGS and you click the scoring button to see what the score is and you visually see the sort of shrouds of black's territory and white, which again is based on how well an AI could play versus the updated one that is more appropriate for your level? Is there any thought or ability for that sort of visualization to come into play during a game?
We have that capability, and I've thought about using it. One of the things I've heard from viewers and from other people that we've beta tested with is that it kind of obfuscates the board. It blocks the view, the visuals, and makes it hard to understand what's there and open. I still really like it. I think I like it for new players. I've been trying to figure out how to do that so well that it wouldn't bother people, like maybe adding kind of like a level of very light shading, so it doesn't actually block too much, but it gives you a sense of, what's what. Because I do think for a new player, understanding like, oh, black's generally surrounding this, white's generally surrounding that could help a lot.
You took a really great example with the NFL. There is tons of money poured into all of these, so that they are trying to figure out the best way to engage people, right? To watch these things with the virtual line of scrimmage. But then also, notice how they'll do the plays, right? They'll start drawing on the actual screen. Hey, you run this way, you do a pass route this way. I almost wonder if that fog visualizer can be something that is flashed up onto the board and then unflashed.
You beat me to it. Yeah, that's exactly my conclusion after that was not necessarily like have it on or off all the time, but I give the commentators the ability to, at certain times, show it. But then there's additional level of commentator training that needs to happen anyway. And then during that, I would also suggest to them, hey, you have these access to these tools to help trigger these kind of things, or give it to the broadcaster behind the scenes. Typically, it's like myself or Jeremiah Donnelly sitting behind a computer, not on screen, and we're controlling the stream to make sure it goes well. So that could be, I love that idea. So you're already in the mindset. We should join the team.
Not a novel idea, I'm sure, but very cool to think that you guys are navigating that and trying to think about it. Here's some more fun lightning round questions that I had with BenKyo. When trying to improve at Go, should you focus on improving your weakness or improving your strengths, and why?
Yeah, it can depend on the player's level maybe, but in general, I think weaknesses. On the one hand, it's kind of a balancing act because on the one hand, I encourage people to often follow what they're enjoying the most when it comes to study, because any kind of proper Go study where you're actually learning new things and cultivating some part of your Go is a plus, right? It's better than nothing. A lot of time people just play and don't study, so it's still going to be better than that. You're into Endgame one day and you're into Joseki the other day, right? You just follow it. Yeah, so following what you enjoy is going to have a tendency to be working on your strengths sometimes, but I think that's fine. At the same time, we do need a certain amount of working on our weaknesses. I remember the first time I ever felt sort of stuck, I guess by some definition, like how many months or something, right? Was around 2 dan or so was my biggest stuck point. And it's because my reading and fighting were too bad and my power was in opening and endgame. So I had to balance out and I could not improve after that. And then once I fixed that a little bit, which it was still a weakness, but it was patched up a bit, then I started to rank up again. As you go up the ladder in general, and this continues all the way into the pro levels, from what I can see, reading ability and fighting skills and shape and all that kind of fighting middle game type stuff That, as much as I don't, or some version of me in the past wouldn't want to admit it or believe it, that is really the best investment most of the time, because you only need so much study before your opening is okay. And endgame too. I actually haven't studied endgame in like over 10 years. It's good to study endgame and move values and stuff, and I'm actually very passionate about that topic. Part of the reason I'm so passionate for people to learn it is because it's also somewhat one and done in a way. People are going to argue with me about that, but once you understand how move values are counted and you remember a lot of the values of some of the common second line moves and whatnot, you have that from now on. And then your end game is massively powered up compared to like pretty much all Q players. Yeah. So even though end game is probably like one of my strengths kind of side, if anything, I haven't really touched studying it in over 10 years. I just kind of improve it by playing a lot of games.
As a new player, should you start out playing games against a bot or a human?
I would say human. The weaker you are, the lower level you are, the less detrimental maybe it is to focus on bots. Now, of course, when you're higher level, like very high level, there's the new AIs now, which are a lot better than playing against the old bots, right? That have a lot of issues in their play. But in my teaching experience, a lot of students and a lot of people kind of hide behind playing bots. They're afraid to get into the games with humans. It's all in part of that thing, kind of like what I experienced when I was getting into coding, which is kind of preparation purgatory, this like endless cycle of preparing but not doing. We have like game anxiety. All I can say is that game anxiety, you actually kind of experience it less and less over time as long as you face it. When I was 2 or 3 down, I still had crazy amounts of game anxiety. Right now, I have almost disturbingly little of it.
In my world and what I do for my job, there's the thing to recommend to a customer or client that is like rationally the best way to go forward, the most optimal. But then a lot of times we don't do that purely best thing because comfort wise, behaviorally, they can't handle it. And so in Go, to your point, it just happens. Like whether whether you want new players like myself to do it or not, whether it's the ego or whatever it is, we just don't want to get that anxiety with playing with a person.
Fear
We
of
don't want to like
failure and stuff.
failure, definitely. But also there's the risk that that other thing will come out and like chastise you or criticize you or all those fears, right? So exactly. Yeah, it's well said. A few years ago when I was starting to get into Go and starved for any material that was on Go but wasn't about playing Go. So it was something in an audio or video format where I wasn't playing the game. I would Google Go and the words Go game, as I think a lot of us do. And a really interesting book came up about Go in China from the perspective of an anthropologist. And as we were going through feedback and as I was thinking about who we could interview for the next season, I decided to reach out to this professor of this book and see if he'd be willing to chat. And sure enough, he was more than happy to sit down and connect online and have a great conversation. And it was a fascinating conversation as well as an interesting book. So hopefully you get to read the book. I'll put it in the episode notes. And we will go to that conversation now with Professor Marc Moskowitz. Professor Marc Moskowitz, let me just introduce you. You are a professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of South Carolina, and you are focusing on the intersection between gender and popular culture in Chinese-speaking Asia. You're also a recipient of multiple awards, including the Fulbright and the Fulbright Hayes Awards, and you have published 3 books and edited 2 volumes. You've also published in a range of journals, including the China Quarterly, Popular Music, Sexualities, and Visual Anthropology. And since your first trip to the People's Republic of China in the late 1980s, you have lived in Chinese-speaking Asia for a total of over 11 years. So, Professor Moskowitz, thanks so much for being here.
Well, thank you. I'm excited to have this conversation.
First of all, I do want to say that It was really wonderful to read this book, and it actually took me back in a lot of ways because unlike you, where you had spent many years in Chinese-speaking Asia, I did have the opportunity to go to China and live there for about a year back in 2008 to 2009. So right after Beijing Olympics had happened, and it was so cool to hear that you had this story where you decided to go to China after not getting a chance to go to Africa to
Mm,
teach.
mm.
So that was just a really fun little connection to find.
Most of the best things that happened to me in life were completely random, really. When I graduated high school, I hitched across the country, and now I think, what an idiot, but it kind of made me who I am.
Maybe we could start by just diving into your book, Go Nation. This was published back in 2013,
Right.
and it was titled Go Nation Chinese Masculinities and the Game of Weiqi in China. So, for the audience, obviously, we will be referring to Go as the Chinese name, which is Weiqi. And so, we'll be using those terms interchangeably. The first thing that actually struck me as really interesting before we get into the actual argument of the book is the nationalistic approaches to the styles of play. There's a really great line that you provide in the book, and it goes as follows. Chinese discussions of national styles of play come to represent culturally defined personalities and, in a very Confucian sense, link individual manhood directly with a masculinized state. In this depiction, Japan is reserved, artistic, impractical. South Korea is aggressive and focused on winning at any cost. And China, according to the people I interviewed in Beijing, is striving for the happy balance between the two. I just love how you put that together.
I think any country you go to, the speaker is always going to come out sounding like the best. But it is situated in the history of these cultures as well. Japan is seen as being more artistic because they had been dominant for 400 years and they'd really turned it into an art. Koreans were seen as wanting to win at any cost and overlapping with Chinese stereotypes of Koreans as being kind of aggressive to begin with. One of the things that struck me is that the understandings of gameplay overlap very much with kind of xenophobic understandings of other nations, with this underlying competitive edge between East Asian nations.
I thought it was really helpful when you gave this description of Chinese viewing Wei Qi as sport, even though
Yeah,
we would never view it that way. And you're a
yeah,
chess player as well, but
yeah.
we would never view it that way here. But then when you start to look at the different cohorts that you were really interviewing and working with, so from the kids, but particularly the university students, that
Mm.
really becomes apparent in the fact that it can actually help them with their college entrance exam.
Absolutely. And I mean I think it's a sport because it's competition in the Chinese category. But you're right. As Americans, we think of sport as something physical. But I gotta say, I've had games where my heart was beating. So there is a kind of visceral reaction to this stuff. The other thing that reminds me of maybe our conception of sport is kind of like Soviet era chess. These kids drop out of school at age 5 or 6 and are just devoted full time to the game, to learning. I think Russia probably still does this. China still does this for a range of sports. So in that conception of it, the sports definition makes a little bit more sense, I think.
You then go on to talk about how to think about these original carriers of Go and Wei Qi in Japan and Korea and China and
Mm.
Taiwan. You then talk about how there is this sort of lamentation of Japanese players in years closer to the 80s into the 90s having a drop in performance at the
Yeah.
top level. And you talk about how that sort of comes into the very complicated, nuanced relationship between these countries. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, no, I mean it's an interesting set of issues because on the one hand, nationalism in China is quite strong, like it is in the US, I think. So on one hand, everybody was very excited China was doing much better in the game. But on the other hand, everyone of older generation had learned by studying the Chinese masters.
Just a quick note here. I believe Professor Moskowitz is actually referring to Japanese masters, not Chinese ones. Okay, let's get back to the interview.
And so there was a certain kind of nostalgia for this past at the same moment that they were celebrating their victories about this stuff. I think when you study someone's games, you're not just learning a technique, you see the personality. So in chess, for example, the difference between Bobby Fischer, where, he's a point counter, right? He's trying to get one pawn more than the other guy, versus Kasparov, who plays these wild, imaginary, complex moves to intimidate his opponent. And they're both beautiful in their own ways, but as you study them, you feel you get to know their personalities a little bit. And in the same way, I think most Chinese people, the older generation, they learn by studying Japanese textbooks, so to speak, kind of play by play of games that have been played. The newer generation were looking more at Korean at the time of the book, because Koreans had kind of were dominating the world at that point. You see this nostalgia in the US perhaps with, it's the end of an era when the dream team is no longer playing. So you could celebrate the changes and you could argue, well, these guys now are better than those guys then, but there's still this moment in time where you look back and say, that was really a magical moment in this sphere.
And it's so interesting because you give sort of the background of Weiqi as a metaphor for so
Mm.
many things, right?
Mm.
And for often very paradoxical or contradictory things at the same time, particularly in these three groups of men that you follow in China. You talk about this dramatic conceptual shift, particularly around its emphasis on Confucian values and Confucian ethics. So you say, from representing the game as a quote small skill to a wanton waste of one's energies to one of the four high arts, and then it goes on to be an illustrative point on the nature of war with Mao Zedong. And then it goes on to turning into something different during the Cultural Revolution, which we're going to get into a little bit more because you speak about that quite a bit as being, ironically, perhaps a spreader of this very elitist level game or noble art, which is interesting. And then you go on to these other things. You say, well, Weiqi can also be an emblem of Buddhist detachment or of Taoist celebration of cosmic significance or war or of benevolent rule, all these sorts of things all at the same time, which I think is often what a lot of folks enjoy in the game. Does that resonate with you still? Has it changed over time for you?
I grew up playing chess as a kid, and
Mm,
chess has its own metaphors, right? You see it in
mhm.
commercials with cognac and men in suits, and it has these certain elite connotations, in spite of the guys playing in parks or, Bobby Fischer popularizing it. But I think with Go, it really, there are mythologies of deities playing it. Their origin myths of the Emperor Yao creating it because he had a son that was either unruly or a little bit dense, depending on the version of the story. Buddhist monks played a good amount because they had time. And so it was linked with meditation and ways of being willing to let loose and not become too attached to things. So I think these metaphors still carry on. And as you point out, during the Cultural Revolution, it was really criticized, but people had a lot of time on their hands during the Cultural Revolution. A lot of intellectuals were sent to the countryside to get them out of the cities. And so they, a lot of them just sat around playing Go for hours a day. And I think that popularized the sport, if you want to call it a sport, a game in our terminology, in ways that had never been seen before.
That's a really interesting point that I wasn't aware of because you, in your interviews with some of the retirees in the
Mm.
park, but as well as university students, they were talking about how Wei Qi was actually one of the reasons Nie Wei Ping, the sort of father of Chinese Wei Qi, that's how he started playing. You were interviewing Rui, and he said that he was a quote sent down youth. What does that mean?
Well, the Sentinel used during the Cultural Revolution, it was about 10 years where Mao Zedong, the leader of China, he was starting to lose control. And so he came up with a way of getting people who were likely to create protests, who tended to be, college students, same as the US when you think about it. But his solution was send them to the countryside to learn from farmers. And in a communist state, this made sense. But the underlying practical reasons for it were to just get rid of the people likely to protest. But these people, these scholars, these elites, go to the countryside and they were useless. These multi-generation farmers, they knew how to work. They had the work ethic. They knew how to plant and when to plant. So it was basically the people who had been sent down were politically necessary. They had to put up with them, but they weren't really very functional. They weren't very useful. And so after the day's work, no TV because they didn't have a lot of money, or maybe there'd be one community TV that everybody could go to. So people spent time playing Go with each other. The other advantage of playing Weiqi is that this was a time where, wives were forced to betray their husbands and say, oh, this guy's politically wrong. And children betrayed their parents and neighbors betrayed neighbors. And so one of the advantages of sitting around playing board games all day is you're occupying. It's a very wonderful way to build a friendship, but you could avoid anything that might be used against you. You mentioned I was studying three different groups, children who were being trained to play and university students. And then I spent some time at parks with retired people. And that generation, man, they're not forthcoming. And so Go gives them a way to create these very deep relationships without exposing themselves emotionally. I was kind of surprised in that way. Having said that, again, in the US, we have a real problem right now with opioid addiction with working class men who, like me, were kind of trained, don't show your feelings, don't show your emotions. And as a result, they become kind of isolated. So, in a very different political spectrum, you see how a larger political economy can shape individual identities. And I think Go is a wonderful way to just hang out and let the politics slide by and not worry about these overwhelming politics that people were immersed in.
So that brings us to the main part of your book, which was really this process of really examining these three different groups of men playing Go in very different contexts. You start the book by really presenting your thesis. And this really focuses on thinking of how the game was used and perhaps still is used in China for training children in the ways of commerce, social interaction, proper manhood, because it is a game that is predominantly played by men, though perhaps that's changing over time. And then you also talk about university students, and you say that it's used, quote, to voice anxieties about the unimaginably competitive nature of the current economy and to find models of behavior that draw on age old ideals of elite gentlemen via the Confucian ideals. And then finally, that third group, right, the senior citizens in the park, and they perceive it as a completely different way, right?
Yeah.
They look at it as, oh, this is sort of the positive memories we have from the days of old, despite going through some of the most challenging and traumatic experiences that perhaps a group of people or a generation could go through.
Yeah, it was so interesting, these different groups. The children, I think a lot of them were there because their middle class or affluent parents wanted them to learn discipline. They thought it would help them learn math, which I think is probably true. It teaches them to sit and concentrate, to use logic. I went to school in the inner city, so my education was lacking and across the board. I think one of the things that got me through and into college was I had played chess as a kid. My dad taught me how to play, and neither of us were very good, but it taught me to think out step by step logic. If I do this, and that will happen, then that will happen, and that will happen. And I think that really helped train me intellectually in a way that maybe my school system was not fulfilling. And then, the college students were under so much pressure, so much pressure. I mean, I think with our job market in the US, we obviously have our own struggles here. But imagine a nation of 1.4 billion people in a country about the same size as the US, and you get a sense of just how competitive it was. And it was the first time, I think, in a long while that even if you got a degree from the best universities in China, you were not guaranteed a job. And if you got that job, would it be a good enough job for your parents' investment? Would it be a good enough job if you came from a poor village where the entire village pitched in to get you special tutoring to get into college? They felt this enormous, enormous pressure. And Go in China, I think at the time there were only 20 professionals allowed a year. So it was tremendously competitive if you wanted to become the best. And a lot of the people I interviewed at the university were actually on the team, the Go team. And, a couple had been professional and they thought going to the most elite university in China was a lot less stressful than, being in Go school. In the park, it was primarily working class guys who couldn't afford indoors. I mean, I went there in winter. I was wearing a leather jacket with a big winter coat on top of it and gloves and shivering. They were out there. They were out there every day. For them, I think it was social. The style of play was different as well. So the university players were super quiet when they played, kind of the rules of playing chess here. Super quiet, super respectful. The game itself, I think, was more reserved. It was more cautious. And these Go players at the park, they were super aggressive. Fente, I think, is the Japanese word, seizing the initiative. And that was seen almost as a kind of masculinity for the elderly people at the park. Someone who didn't really push to the very limit was seen as kind of a wimp and not a real man. To me, the most surprising thing about the park was kibitzing, or sitting around in a group and telling the player, oh, this is a better move, that's a better move, was absolutely okay in the park. Not okay with the children's school, not okay at the university level. But at the park, man, that was the norm. At first, being American, I was, raised, don't do that. That's bad. I kind of rebelled against that. But as I saw people playing more, I came to realize that this was because this group of players, they couldn't afford to go to school. They couldn't afford to go to these evening classes. They couldn't afford all the training mechanisms that were available to my other two groups. And so the kibitzing, or talking about, what's the best move as a group, was a kind of way of mutual training. And getting back to this notion of friendship, it became a way of showing affection for each other, like helping each other, rather than this individualistic streak that I think is more familiar to the chess world or the Weiqi world at the children and university level.
You were sort of shocked that these players in the park had reached such high levels. And in the book, you're saying, gosh, how did these players get so good? They didn't have formalized training. That was one thing you pretty much highlighted, because they did not have the wealth to get that. Even if it was in a Weiqi club that was one room in a building, it was just too expensive for them to pay 4 yuan, right, which is the
Yeah.
currency at the time, to do that. You talk about how the kibitzing really was probably the way that
Yeah.
they had these incredible levels of improvement. And you also said there were also maybe some more challenges because perhaps memory at that age is not quite as strong. So their ability to go through and play each move after to review might not have been the best way to do it.
The university students, they could replay a game by memory, as many professionals can. But yeah, I think they were playing to their strengths. And it was remarkable that they played so well. It was remarkable that they played at all. I keep making these American comparisons, but Bobby Fischer, before he came along in chess, most Americans who played were very elite people. And Bobby Fischer, suddenly people in the Bronx, like my dad, were playing because they
Mm.
saw that this kid from New York, this poor kid with no training, could do it. And so I'm always struck when people do things outside of their expectations as a class. In Taiwan, for example, there are no park players. This is very much something going on with China. And I think it links back to, as you pointed out, the Cultural Revolution days where poor
Mhm.
people were being exposed to the game by the sent down youth. And so when something that has such elite connotations like Weiqi spreads in these wonderfully creative ways to other groups and they gain access to it, that's very exciting. I think the internet now, with being able to play online, is another one that I don't want to discount the expense of that, and not everybody could afford computers or the internet in China, but a lot can. And they're getting exposure to gameplay that would have been limited to a very, very few people before the internet. So these exciting technological and political transformations of the political economy shed light on the lives of individual choice. And these guys who had been sent down youth, who knows what they might have become if they hadn't been born in such a tumultuous time in Chinese history.
If we take a step back and go first to the kids in the Weiqi schools, you actually give us a really nice preface into how Weiqi embodies these Confucian values. And one particular way you do that is you talk about this fact, because this really feeds into your argument of concepts of masculinity, that there are these two senses of Wen and Wu. Physical strength was really not highlighted as nearly as valuable as having, knowledge and proper behavior and ethics and things like this. Can you tell us how that then leads into the values of Weiqi and Go?
Wen was seen as kind of the intellectual, the cultured. Wu was seen as the martial and the rugged, the physical. American culture, I think we very much celebrate the physical in some ways, especially me. I came of age in the 80s. That was kind of a time where everybody was hitting the gym and men did what men did. And luckily, we've evolved past some of that. I think we're happier in this generation, to tell the truth. But, in China, I think there was always a prioritizing of the intellectual. And arguably, that's one reason China's done so well economically is, as far as technological advancement. And so this notion that Go trains both very well was embedded in the child training. So it was thought that it's intellectual for the obvious reasons, as we talked about before. It teaches you to think ahead, it teaches you concentration, it teaches you mathematics. But it's also seen as something that gives you fiber. It gives you a kind of a moral rectitude to not be dominated by other men. There's an old famous soldier called Guanggong, and he's actually been deified. So people actually worship him now. But there's a famous painting of him playing Weiqi as a poison arrow is getting removed. Not just an arrow, but a poison arrow is getting removed from his arm. And so the idea of this general validating his martial prowess through intellectual endeavor shows this blending of the martial and the Wen and Wu, the martial and the cultured, in important ways. General Guanggong is really a wonderful embodiment of the two. But at the end of the day, the soldier was always to serve the emperor. The physical was always to serve the intellectual. I think a lot of this training of that balance is seen in the ways people conceptualize Weiqi.
And you go back to this example at the end of the book, to this concept of the suffering mad genius when we think about in the West, the chess player. And perhaps this is provided as an example because in some ways that's what happened to Bobby Fischer, right? There was sort of this perhaps a mental breakdown, perhaps paranoia. We don't know exactly. Whereas in China, it's very much not seen as a negative. If you have this ability to play Weiqi well, you're seen as smart. You're seen as building all these skills that you've alluded to as well. So I think that's just a really striking aspect of what you talked about in your book.
Fischer was absolutely mentally ill. There's no question about that. And to some degree, we take, I think, pleasure from these narratives of the genius who suffers, right? A Beautiful Mind, this movie about a mathematician with schizophrenia, or, there are a million examples of this. And to some degree, I think we as audiences watching films enjoy, okay, he's better than us, but yet not, he suffers too. And this is a good thing. In the book, I overstated a little bit because there's still the cool kids who are, they're dating and they're playing music, and they're probably still the ones who are more successful romantically. But you're absolutely right that what we would call nerdy kids are also celebrated in their own way. I think today it makes more sense in the US as well, since the tech guys hit the scene. I think before them, it was seen as Wall Street aggressive businessmen were the ideal form of masculinity, or weightlifters. And then the tech bros came and they kind of changed the narrative. Like, no, success can be intellectual purely. And so I think these dynamics in China, I think have been more longstanding. I think there's a almost universal respect for education. Where I grew up, people who went to college were teased by their parents, by friends, as putting on airs, that this kind of working class value. And that I just didn't see that in China. The son of or daughter of a truck driver, that truck driver wanted their kid to go to college. They might not be able to afford it. There may be obstacles where they said, look, this just isn't for you because I just can't pay for school. I can't pay for your books, these kinds of things. But as far as a universal desire, I would say it's almost universal in China. Whereas in the U.S., we're descendants of criminals and other kind of rugged people. Australia as well, and as a result, I think the U.S. and Australia probably have a longer standing undercurrent of anti-intellectual sentiment, knee-jerk reaction against the intellectual in favor of doing things with your hands and these things. And in China, I think through every era that I'm aware of, I think it wasn't like that. There was much more of a celebration of intellectual prowess. Even Mao Zedong, who, he grew up in a farming community and, he took over, led the communist revolution. He was the first leader of communist China. But, he created legitimacy for himself as a de facto emperor after the imperial system had ended. But the way he did that is he wrote poetry. He used Go metaphors, as you pointed out. So he adopted all this elite strategy of intellectual prowess to validate who he was. Being a nerdy guy at heart, somebody who spends more time with books and people, there's something to be said for that. The smart people don't have to be apologetic. Most of the leaders in Taiwan, for example, have PhDs or degrees from the best institution, National Taiwan University. Most of the presidents in China have had PhDs in things like building bridges and, these very practical things, but they still were highly, highly educated people. And the idea of pretending to be one of the masses, which our politicians tend to do even when they go to Harvard and such, it's just a different dynamic. Intellectual prowess is how to get ahead, and it's a different value system. To me, it's exciting to look at these cultural values and not say one's better than the other, but to say what a different world they grew up in than, say, the world I grew up in. And that's kind of exciting to see.
As we wrap up the episode, what do you think are some things that we could do to make watching the top-level professional Go games more engaging, easier to understand, easier to connect with? What are things we can borrow from other sports or activities that do a really good job of this? Thanks so much, and I'll talk to you next time.